Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure now to introduce you to a gentleman that I only met 10 minutes ago. And there was no biography, so it was great because I actually had to talk to him to find out a little bit about him. So I'm going to introduce you in a minute to Boudewijn Nuyens. I actually had to write his name down on my hand because Boudewijn started his life in Holland, although when he was 4, he left on a ginormous road trip that ultimately took him to Vancouver via 7 other countries. And he has an extremely interesting background, but one of the things that he's done as an engineer is that he's been the head of the Canadian delegation to all things standards, so everything to do with the ISO. And I know that we're going to be fascinated by the conversation that he's going to have with us today. So I'd like you very much, please, to join with me in welcoming Boudewijn as he takes the stage and we get to enjoy your presentation. Hopefully I didn't slaughter your name.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I am Boudewijn. Actually, Kate spent a fair bit of time not only scribbling on her hand, but rehearsing. Boudewijn is a complicated name. I am Dutch. There's no way of avoiding it with a name like that. What we're going to talk about today is, of course, getting serious about social. And I was asked by my esteemed colleagues here in Australia to kind of start working on that. For an engineer, that's a difficult topic. We're not known to be social animals. So I'll do my very best, and let's see how it goes. So maybe 2 seconds about Copperleaf. We're actually a software company. We build decision analytics tools for large infrastructure owners and operators around the world and help them make decisions which include, of course, increasingly social aspects. So on today's journey, I'm going to take you to Canada, which is a country that I know much better than Australia. I've lived there for the last 20 years. Is there any Canadians in the audience? Oh, there's one. Uh-oh. So please, at some point, oh, two. Okay, well, if I insult you in any way, just please don't take it personally. Because I am going to be talking about 3 cities, carefully selected cities, and see how they do on a relative scale with regards to social value. Now, the good thing with most cities in Canada, and I'm sure the same as in Australia, there's still growth. Cities are growing, population is growing, and with that, it gives you a bit more leeway. It also gives you some challenges, of course, with regards to what you have to do. So my first city is, of course, my home city, that's Vancouver. It's on the coast, on the west coast of Canada, as I'm sure you know. It's also the largest of the 3, and I'll come back to it in a second. The second one is Kelowna, which you might not know. That's in the interior of British Columbia, and it's actually mostly known as the wine capital of British Columbia, and actually of Canada, for that matter. And the third one is Calgary, which is in Alberta, a place where, generally speaking, we don't go. But it serves its purpose today, so I'll use them as an example. So first is Vancouver. Now, Vancouver of the 3, of course, is the best known. It's a world-class city. It's right up there with places like Sydney in many of the rankings, etc. It's also still relatively fast-growing. It grows between 1 and 2% a year in population. It's also, from the 3, the most mature, of course. It has great environmental credentials because it's the birthplace of Greenpeace. So, from the 60s onwards, Vancouver has always been known as a very green and socially conscious city. I do think, though, that it's largely living on its past glory, in the sense over the last 10, 20 years, the social credentials of Vancouver have steadily been declining, and you will see that in the way that they make decisions when it comes to infrastructure. There is a little bit of consultation, but not much, in my humble opinion. It's largely based on qualitative assessments as opposed to quantitative, and frankly, very quickly it turns into political debate. So there is actually very little data and very little rigor in the way they make infrastructure decisions, and it shows. Where in the 60s, it was really considered to be a model, especially in North America, not so much anymore. Let's move on to Kelowna. Kelowna is far smaller. It's actually about, as you can see, about 220,000 people, so 1/10 of the size, roughly speaking. But it is the fastest growing city in British Columbia. And that's a combination of perfect weather and actually, in relative terms, quite cheap still compared to Vancouver. And with COVID and the pandemic, a lot of people now working remotely have decided, of course, to move to better places, and Kelowna is one of them. Kelowna is, as I said, primarily known for its wine, but it actually does make better decisions than Vancouver, I think, at this point in time. It's doing more quantitative work as far as really determining what matters and what not. Then, unfortunately, it takes those to the directors of the different infrastructure departments within the city and has them poll equal votes on a scale of 1 to 5, which is not very scientific. And generally speaking, therefore, the decision making is okay, but by no means perfect. It does include some social metrics. And that brings us to Calgary. Calgary is, of course, on the other side of the Rockies, so we pretend it doesn't exist, but it actually does exist. And it is actually the oil capital of Canada, so a very different animal in the sense that their economy was very much driven by the oil sands in Alberta, which we consider to be the dirtiest way of producing oil, but they seem to like it. And the city has grown quite a bit, except that in the last decade they've had a few problems. First of all, they had a massive flood that actually kind of wiped out a fair bit of the city, and then oil has been up and down, as we all know, in the last few years, so it actually has destroyed their economy. Right now, about 30% of their office buildings are empty, and that, of course, hurts when it comes to taxation and, by extension, what you can do with a city. But I have to say, much to my displeasure, that they actually know how to take decisions. They actually, over these 10 years, have really developed a methodology for decision making when it comes to infrastructure, which is quite remarkable. I would say it's world class. And therefore, they do all the right things. They look at triple bottom line. They monetize as much as possible. They really bring in the community. They survey, and they use a very consistent framework to help them in their decision making. So good for them. It actually drives sometimes interesting decisions. For instance, they are trying to put urban farming into empty office buildings. I wonder how that's going to work, and I also wonder what they're going to farm, but maybe they're smoking something funny that they're trying to farm, but we'll see how that goes. It does translate, of course, into economic reality, or you have to kind of bring it in line with economic reality. If you look, and I hope you can read it from a distance, these are the real estate prices in the three cities. And if you look at Vancouver versus Kelowna versus Calgary, what you'll see is that Vancouver, of course, is the most expensive city in Canada. We all knew that. It's right up there with the other few cities in the world that are outrageously expensive. The median price of a house, the average price of a house is 1.3 million Canadian, which is roughly the same in Australian dollars right now. As you can see, Kelowna is a bit cheaper, and then Calgary is significantly cheaper. If you compare that to the salaries, Calgary, being an oil city, actually has the highest salaries. So now if you translate that into affordability at the far right, needless to say, Calgary is much better off, or Calgarians are much better off than the other two, with Vancouver taking in the crown there with 112% of your monthly income having to go to pay down your house. So how exactly you do that is a mystery to me, but that's where we stand. Actually, the last little nugget on this particular slide is the unable to speculate line there, which tells you how prices are going up and down sometimes in Canada, but mostly up, typically 20% per year. So it is a bit of an insane kind of market, but what it tells you is that if this is a good economic indicator of desirability of a city, then everybody is clearly wanting to go to Vancouver. And yet, we just saw that from a kind of current policy point of view as to how to build infrastructure, Calgary is way ahead. They're also ahead in something else. They figured out that because of this affordability, they really should market themselves as such. And that's what they've been doing for the last year. Actually, when you get your newspaper, generally speaking, the whole cover is an ad to move to Alberta. And as you can see, this is Jason Kenney, their premier, and he's pitching for bigger paychecks, smaller rent checks. Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, a shorter commute to a bigger house. It's on TV, it's on billboards, it's in your newspapers, you can't avoid it. They're trying to steal everybody from Vancouver, which is ironic because 10 years ago what they did is they rounded up all the homeless in Calgary, put them on a plane and sent them to Vancouver with a one-way ticket. So, it's kind of like social movement going both ways. They're getting rid of their homeless, and they want the more affluent people from us. So interesting battles happening across the Rockies. But as I said, from an infrastructure point of view, they're very well organized and very principled. And the few things I remember from my MBA, the first one is action goes where money flows. And they apply this extremely well. They monetize absolutely everything they can, so that they really can turn it into dollars, which then drives behavior, of course, and investment. The second is what you can't measure, you cannot manage. And again, they do this extremely well. They're very good at measuring the impact of every single decision they make when it comes to infrastructure. And the net result is actually very simple. That is, according to The Economist, they are the most livable city in Canada right now. So, you know, kudos to them. Vancouver used to be this, by the way. So it's shifted over to Calgary. Vancouver is now, I think, number 3 in Canada and number 5 in the world. Calgary is number 1 in Canada and number 3 in the world. So good for Calgary. So this just tells you that it works. Like if you're making decisions based on a rational and well-informed framework, including social components, it really does pay off. And what they do on the social side is they use the social return on investment framework, where, as I'm sure you know, you have the 7 principles, and they apply them very religiously. The asset management director of the city is extremely good at this. So, if we want to replicate this, obviously we need a framework, SROI being one, but if you do a bit of research, you'll soon discover that there is actually, unfortunately, hundreds of frameworks for social value. Now, these are just a few that come to mind. And actually, Iris Plus was the one that intrigued me most, because in the back, there's a little appendix where they actually kind of correlate themselves to 50 other frameworks. So it's a bit mind-boggling, and at some point you're going to have to make up your mind as to what is the framework that I want to use. Thankfully, the world is simplifying itself a little bit. We heard a lot about ESG earlier today, and ESG does bring a bit of focus, maybe because the finance community is behind it, and with that the auditors, of course, are pushing in a very specific direction what they want to see. So you're moving away from financial accounting only into something which really talks about value creation in what you're reporting, and eventually, of course, you get into impact-driven reporting. So in other words, what are you achieving with the investments and with the actions of the organization? Now, ESG on paper is just reporting. So you're essentially measuring and you're reporting, hopefully in a credible way and in a repeatable way. But of course, as an organization, that generally speaking will drive at some point an analysis as to where do we have to improve. And that's the good part of the whole game. That is, it'll drive your strategy, it'll drive your decisions, and it'll create a virtuous circle where continuously, year to year, you're going to improve, hopefully, over the years past. And with that, ESG now becomes a real driver for change. Again, that primarily means that you need a framework of some kind to which you're measuring yourself and that everybody within the organization understands. So that's your value framework. So to illustrate that in a bit more detail, I'm shifting countries now. I'm going to, actually to Kate's country, I'm going to the UK, because as you well know, the UK has done quite a bit of work in that regard, both on the social side and in general on the regulatory side. And my example, therefore, is a water company. It's Anglian Water. It's actually the largest of the water companies in the UK by territory. And they do water and wastewater. They're based in the east, the blue area there on the screen. And they did a few interesting things. First of all, they're big, as I said, 7 million customers. But also, they were the first company to actually write into their Articles of Constitution, so basically really the base of the company, their purpose, which is, as it says on the screen here, being environmental and social prosperity to the region we serve through commitments to love every drop. And they're really, really serious about this. If you go on their website, they keep hammering it on it. Like, it's the environmental and the social sides are absolutely key for them. They align themselves very closely with the SDGs, and as good engineers, they actually went and looked at every single one of the cubes that are on your tables there and actually decided what relevance those different principles would have, or the different goals would have on the organization. And the little round scales there are essentially the percentage of importance that they consider that particular goal to have within their organization. So you can see that some of them are highly relevant, of course, the ones that are tied to water, some of them not so much, but they try to influence or to play on all of the SDGs or a lot of the SDGs. Now, when it comes to decision making, you have to narrow that down. So they look very much at the triple bottom line as a starting point. And then they actually kind of expand a little bit because there's a strong push in the UK in that direction to basically the 6 capitals. And so this comes again from their literature. They really kind of explain how for every single decision they make on the infrastructure level, they're going to look at the 6 capitals and they're going to see like, how do I contribute or how does this affect my scoring on the 6 capitals? So little example, this is a fictitious example, but it actually builds on very much the way that they operate. If you know your 6 capitals, you need obviously metrics. So their metrics, which they use roughly, I paraphrase a few of them, but these are their metrics. And they use these metrics for every single decision that they make at the infrastructure level. So it's non-optional. If you are a project sponsor or if you want to bring a business case to management, you have to score every single one of these elements, of course, if they're relevant, to your particular project. And the way they do that is by questionnaires. So noise, for instance, would be one of the factors there. So is noise of importance to your project, or can it generate noise? If so, you have to define the type of noise, the location, and the length of the impact. And now my slides have jumped out of their presentation mode. And here we're back. Good. And so they will quantify, therefore, the different types of noise that you could possibly be generating in buckets. Same for locations, etc. And then the combination thereof gets quantified. And they quantify in 2 different ways, in pounds in this case, UK pounds, and that is the societal cost and what they call the private cost, which is really their internal costs, so the one that we would normally consider as an organization. So for every single one of those combinations, as you can see, there's 2 costs. There's what it will cost society and what it will cost internally. And if I now go and decide, okay, well, my particular project is of the level of noise of a diesel truck, and it's in a rural environment, okay, that means that the societal cost is £80,000 and my internal cost is £2,000. And then the question becomes, what's the length of the impact? Let's say it's a 4-day work project. Okay, well, that then multiplies that by 4. And the last element, an important one actually, is it time variant? So does it matter if I do it today or if I were to do it next year? Which for noise doesn't presumably make much of a difference, but there's other factors where it might well change with time. So this is an important factor that I take into consideration. So then the question becomes, how do they come to the numbers? Like, where do the 80 and the 2,000 in this case come from? Now, the 2,000 is internal cost, so they can figure it out whatever way they want. The societal costs, they spend their life basically doing surveys. So they go out every single year and they survey thousands and thousands of their constituents to basically figure out, okay, what is the willingness to pay, what is the willingness to accept, and other factors that they might use to actually determine these monetary factors for every single one of the criteria that is in their value framework. So they're very systematic about it, and they keep going about it every year to make sure that the costs are as accurate as they possibly can be, and this in turn allows them to monetize absolutely everything. And it seems to work in the sense that, generally speaking, there is a broad consensus that the numbers are correct. Now, the other thing, of course, is what do I do with this? Effectively, what we're doing is a multi-criteria decision analysis. So obviously, you need the consistency. We just talked about that. The fact that we're calculating both the private and the societal costs and benefits, needless to say. You make it time variant. You make it flexible in the sense that you want your project managers to come up with different alternatives or options for the project, and they might have, of course, different costs and different benefits. You explore what would happen on the different scenarios. The obvious one being, the pandemic, which derailed most plans, and you have to kind of rethink your portfolios. They do so on a pretty broad scale to make sure they really come up with robust portfolios. They often have to put things in competition because there's not enough resources to do everything. In order to really compete things, you actually need to monetize so that you now can actually start optimizing in a mathematical way and come up with your ideal portfolio of things that will generate the highest value for the lowest possible cost. And then finally, this makes it all very transparent and auditable, which in their case is very important because they are, of course, a regulated utility. So auditability is extremely important. Transparency is important to their stakeholders in general. So what's the outcome? Well, very simply, the line that I kind of circled in red there at the top, that's them. They are actually the highest ranking utility in the water sector in the UK. Every year, Ofwat actually does a survey for the service and delivery ratings, and Anglian has been at the top for quite a while. So it works. Like if you have a rational and well-documented way of making decisions, including your social values, clearly you'll wind up at the top of the pack. So this is extremely good news, and it does show that there is a way of actually valuing social components within your decision-making in the infrastructure sector and come out at tops, basically. And they're profitable, by the way, too, because they're actually privately owned. All right, so let's go back to Calgary just to wrap it up now for a second. Unfortunately, money is not everything in life, right? We all know that. And this is an interesting project. It's a bridge, which looks like a high-speed train. And it was built in Calgary by an architect called Calatrava, who's out of Spain, very famous architect. And the reason they did this is because Calgary wanted something spectacular. And of course, that's where things get a bit difficult, because spectacular and social value don't necessarily align. Yes, of course, the bridge kind of shortens the commute, connects communities, etc. So there's good reasons to build the bridge, but why spend the extra money commissioning Calatrava to come up with a gorgeous bridge? Well, they figured that it was worth it for something that they call shine. So at some point, in addition to the monetary factors and kind of coming up with monetary benefits, they have a scale of 1 to 5 for shine. And normal stuff will be a 2 or a 3, but every once in a while they'll make a 5 out of 5 project because they feel that actually it's worth it. It can literally kind of make the city as a whole shine, it can attract tourism, it can make everybody proud, etc. So this was a shine project. Unfortunately, with shine, you also kind of create emotions which go the other way. And consequently, if you look, there's a lot of glass on that bridge. And not too long ago, two wonderful Calgarians decided that they disagreed with the spending of money on shine, and they smashed every single window on the bridge. So that was $1 million right there. The city, of course, was very upset. They decided to rebuild or kind of repair the bridge, but they also used the opportunity to call upon the social fabric of the city, and they actually turned the place into a gallery. It's hard to see on the picture, but they call it actually the Vandalism Gallery. And they actually have pictures of art, pictures, of Michelangelo, etc., hanging on the bridge now, reminding everybody that art is something that has to be protected. So they're calling on the civic duty of everybody in the city to actually call in if they see vandalism and actually kind of try to make a better place for everybody. So interesting little development there. And then finally, I'm going to Holland because I'm sorry, I'm Dutch. I have to put a plug in for Holland. But again, it plays on the same theme that is, in this case, again, bridges, art, and how do you value it. And so this happens in Rotterdam. Not exactly the most exciting of cities. It's a big harbor city, but again, the city decided at some point to shine and to put in these two pieces of art, which are essentially tails of whales out of fiberglass that plunge into a pond behind the railing there, to essentially to hide the ugly concrete structure which is just behind them. So it was a shine exercise. But then many years later, this happened one day. All of a sudden, there's a train sitting on top of the whale tails. And so you wonder, what on earth just happened here? Well, if you take another perspective, this is what happened. The concrete structure was a bridge that actually holds the end station of a metro line in Rotterdam, and the driver fell asleep. The train kind of shot off the rails, and the whale tail was there to catch it. So basically, the whale tail was actually a safety feature, right? Because it saved the train and the driver. And so, when you look at that, you go, okay, well, whoever put those tails in place there, like the project manager, he was a really clever guy. Because, he actually saw that there was 1 in a million probability that at some point the train would fly off the rails and he'd be there to catch it. I don't think that's what happened, but it does drive the point home that when you're building infrastructure and you're trying to justify your infrastructure, you need to think very broadly. In this particular case, obviously the original justification was art or shine, but there was a safety feature in there. And if you flip it around, in most of our projects, it's the opposite, of course. Like, we're primarily going for safety, for convenience, for like obvious things, or productivity, or higher capacity. But there might be other factors, softer factors, that we can actually include in our justification. And that actually helps us think in a broader sense. So that's the important message here, that is like you have to really think as broad as possible when you come up with your infrastructure projects and your justifications. So in summary, action goes where money flows. Try to monetize as much as possible, because monetization makes it easy to explain it to the rest of the community, and in particular to your CFO, what needs to happen. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. We've heard that a lot, but it's actually very true, especially if you want to improve continuously. Think triple bottom line or 6 capitals. Pick a rigorous framework. If you're going to quantify stuff, and if you want to come back and use it over and over, you need to build that level of rigor and credibility within your organization. So you have to stick with it, and you have to use it for all your capital decisions. And then finally, generally speaking, unfortunately, resources are not unlimited, so you're going to have to manage portfolios of stuff in competition. And for that, again, you need monetization very often just to be able to compare apples to pears and to actually come to the right decision. So there you go. That was my little story. Hopefully that was useful and interesting. And now back over to Kate.
Thank you. Baudovan, my new friend, that was the most extraordinary example of a positive externality I think I've ever heard, and definitely one I shall steal in the future. Now, we're already running behind because there's just so much to get through. Without much further ado, I'm therefore going to introduce our next speaker and invite her to the stage. So I'm extremely pleased to be able to introduce Alexandra Monson, who's the Group Manager of Sustainability at Ventia. Oh, you were on my other side. I was like, oh, she's not there. Thought I'd lost you. That was wonderful.
Today to provide a service provider perspective in this discussion on getting serious about social. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, the people of the nations where we're all located, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I would also like to recognise the culture of Mana Whenua in Aotearoa. So I'll provide a brief overview of Ventia and what we do for context, and share how we elevate social considerations in our strategy, sharing some examples of delivering social outcomes in operations, and share how we elevate, and some thoughts on some challenges on this space and what we can do more. So Ventia provides essential infrastructure services with a large workforce of employees and subcontractors across Australia and New Zealand. Our purpose is making infrastructure work for our communities. And our communities are diverse, with more than 400 project sites. 40% of our work is in regional and rural areas. Ventia operates across a broad range of industry segments, including defence, social infrastructure, which includes housing, schools, hospitals and government assets, water, electricity and gas, resources, environmental services and remediation, telecommunications and transport. So that's a lot of different infrastructure. But we're not project proponents or the owners of infrastructure. Rather, we proudly support our clients with operations and maintenance, asset management, facilities management and other services, supporting the full asset life cycle. So a little over a year ago, we took a fresh look at our business strategy, with sustainability now one of our core 3 pillars. And our sustainability strategy is simple, with equal environment, social and governance focus. Our social focus is about being people and community focused. And we have 3 objectives for social sustainability: for our people to be safe, healthy and as diverse as our communities, to engage and respect the communities we work in, and value creation through our local and diverse supply chain. This elevated focus in our strategy puts a spotlight on what we are doing to achieve these objectives across our business. We believe we are creating social value and can positively impact through the services we provide, and I'd like to explore that a little. So our approach to achieving our social objectives can be explained as positive impact through direct employment, so D&I in our workforce, community engagement, and Indigenous and social procurement. Diversity and inclusion employment targets are the more common social metrics that we see in contracts, and we are more mature in our approach to inclusion to some of these underrepresented groups than others. Community engagement for us is about building enduring local relationships, respecting communities, and creating local opportunities. The way that we engage and build those relationships can include through direct sponsorships and grants, such as Aventia Community Grants, or it can be through support for community projects and employee volunteering, or in fact through the delivery of infrastructure services to communities. Delivery of services should and does include a diverse range of local suppliers, but importantly, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Much is through typical engagement, and we also see great outcomes from some smaller scale shared value projects delivered in conjunction with our clients and other partners, identifying small social and Indigenous enterprises with the capacity to grow into a new sector. But meaningful engagement is of what is of value here, with a focus towards longer-term contracts to provide more certainty for smaller business. We know that there's a positive impact to communities from delivering in all these social aspects, even if we don't yet have a consistent method of quantifying overall social value created. We'll take a look at an example of each of these focus areas in the next slides. So with workforce representation, our disability employment journey started some years ago with a focus from a client who set a KPI for disability employment for a social infrastructure project. We engaged a disability and social inclusion manager to drive cultural change, reviewing job design, engaging leaders for buy-in, and engaging disability employment operators. Through these focus efforts, Ventia has achieved a more than 400% increase in employees with a disability. On the one contract with the longest running focus, 7% of the workforce has a disability. But our aim is to be much more representative of the community in which 17% of people have a disability. In our telecommunications team, we're working with Australian Spatial Analytics, or a social enterprise dedicated to training and employing young neurodiverse people, working to change their employment outcomes. Neurodiversity is an advantage in data and spatial analytics. Our initial engagement of one spatial analyst has grown to 10 this year. All are working alongside designers and engineers on critical projects, including the NBN. We're growing this engagement geographically and across sectors. Our partnership with Job Access, which is funded by the Department of Social Services, it helps us work through any barriers to employment and drive our disability initiative across the broader business. Focusing on our New Zealand business for examples of how we provide positive impact through community engagement. Our Te Araurua Working Party encourages participation, fostering positive relationships both inside our business and with local communities, whanua, iwi, Maori organisations and other stakeholders. And there's much that our teams do locally. The Trees for Survival program is supported by Ventia teams from different sectors. It involves sponsorship and employee involvement in planting days at 8 schools this year across Auckland and the Bay of Plenty. Similarly, projects such as the Rosedale Restoration Project, where we provide monthly support providing non-potable water to the site that's being rehabilitated by community members. The social value provided through some engagements is hard to quantify, but is as important as financial support. These examples on the bottom of the slide excuse me, they demonstrate how our New Zealand teams build local relationships. For example, partnering with our client and other suppliers to remove a redundant cell tower recently at St James Church in Auckland when our team working nearby was asked for help. Engaging with residents in a village in the Southern Alps by providing excavated rocks from the works for community use. And through proactive engagement to identify and respond to community needs, such as the way that our telecommunications team engaged and shaped the program of works for delivering fibre to the community of Arrowtown. Ventia's focus on Indigenous participation in Australia has been core to our business since we launched our Reconciliation Action Plan in 2009. And we've held Elevate status since 2013, which we are hugely proud of, and it's something that we do not take for granted. We are therefore more mature in our strategies around Indigenous procurement than other social procurement, providing an opportunity for us to leverage our experience here to grow our impact in other areas and with other communities. We're very proud of our Indigenous procurement approach, which has resulted in an increased procurement spend with Indigenous businesses year on year to $83.9 million last year. That's more than 3% of our total spend. And our holistic approach has seen us leverage our membership of Supply Nation and other Indigenous business support groups, including local chambers of commerce. Rather than just focusing on spend, we also target increasing the number of Indigenous businesses we engage, growing from 40 suppliers in 2017 to 112 last year. As a local example, our Queensland Road asset maintenance contract spent $4.6 million with Indigenous business over the past year, partnering with a local Queensland civil construction company, Black Cat Civil. The engagement goes beyond the delivery of road pavement and drainage rehabilitation that we engage Black Cat Civil for, with both organisations working together to support the Maibin Jayale Yagila men's group in Beaudesert. The engagement approach with Indigenous suppliers has matured, and we seek to transition where possible from one-off purchase order type engagements to contracts. Engaging with our Indigenous suppliers under a contract enables them to make more long-term strategic and investment decisions as they have assurance of income and certainty of engagement, something they simply do not get through the issuance of ad hoc purchase orders. Reflecting on the social value this volume of spend creates, we recognise the impact can go beyond what we see and measure. We understand from Supply Nation that for every $1 spent with an Indigenous supplier, $4.41 worth of social revenue is generated. So the positive impact that we can have in our communities over the longer term contracts, that's what motivates us to do more. We have greater success when we work with others towards a common goal. In addition to the connections made by our teams at local levels, and the relationships and connections through collaborations with clients, our progress to date in delivering social outcomes has been possible due to the relationships and partnerships with these national and state-based organisations. So what's next? At Ventia, we know we have more to do, and what's needed to get serious about social then for us as an industry? Well, firstly, ensuring there is equal focus on social impact for all phases of infrastructure. I hope I've demonstrated just from those few short examples the scale of impact that can be created through the operational phase of infrastructure. Is there more that can be done through the evaluation of projects to identify the social value created over the whole life and not just through construction, for example? Secondly, we can tend to think of community engagement as something that happens at the project level, and it's important to ensure a strategic focus across the whole organisation as a key enabler to achieving social outcomes. For example, by leveraging those national and state-based relationships. Thirdly, how do we value the outcomes of engagement and relationships beyond spend? It would be useful to have a consistent approach to defining social value, like the examples that were shared just before, and agree tools and metrics across jurisdictions. as well as celebrating and sharing the stories of individual projects, if we could aggregate all the examples into a value figure that we could use, we could all use it for our projects and tenders, it would be a great motivator and a way of demonstrating the combined impact of what we can do. And it's also important to ensure we don't disadvantage anyone in society through our decisions, including considering equitable access and inclusion through the energy transition. And a shout out to the ISK Modern Slavery Coalition members, of which Ventia is one, collaborating to build knowledge and capacity around managing modern slavery risks and driving sector-wide solutions. As a service provider, a barrier or limitation to the impact that we can have on social outcomes can be that we are not the proponent and we have a defined scope of work, which is why our relationships and our engagements with and through our clients is important. These ongoing relationships then can become an enabler to accelerate change together. So in conclusion, social value creation can and should be prioritised through all infrastructure lifecycle phases, including operations. Defining an approach to measurement and evaluation of social value will be one of the enablers to elevating the focus of social sustainability across industry. And it sounds like it's emerging as a word of this conference already, but collaboration is essential. Thank you.
You are quite literally the perfect presenter because that was dead on 15 minutes. Thank you so much. You have no idea how much I appreciate that. You know, there's actually not many opportunities in life to be able to introduce people who you've known for a long time, you admire greatly, and you know are an absolutely outstanding presenter. So it is my complete pleasure, my personal pleasure and my professional pleasure to introduce you to our next speakers. So we've got a couple of speakers who are going to come together and they're going to make sure that they present the paper, Unlocking the Outcomes That Matter, Social Value Creation Through Infrastructure Investment. And I'd really like you to welcome to the stage my very good friend, Vanessa Piller.
What such warm words. Thank you, Kate. It's a mutual admiration. Look, thanks for having me here today, and it is about time we get serious about social. I sometimes feel we've forgotten about people when we talk about sustainability, but that definitely hasn't been the case this morning, so you have totally invigorated me. But firstly, before we start, I would like to thank Auntie Christine this morning for welcoming us to country, and I would like to acknowledge the Gabbi Gabbi peoples, the tradition and custodians whose lands and beautiful lands and waters where we meet today. And I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. So what we know is that infrastructure projects, might just do that, are amongst the biggest investments made in communities. Their primary purpose is to create value. And I think what we heard earlier is to in fact allow people to thrive, for cities to flourish and to create these sustainable places. But delivering these broader social outcomes remain a bit of an enigma for those in the infrastructure sector because, as we've heard repeatedly, it's hard to measure and it's hard to quantify. But RPS has partnered with Infrastructure Sustainability Council to try and demystify the role of infrastructure projects and the role it plays in improving a person's well-being and quality of life. So today I'm going to share some of our experiences from working on projects across Australia and New Zealand. But the overarching aim of this paper really is to produce a practical guide for the sector to improve the way projects are delivered by understanding what is important to communities and in turn delivering the outcomes that matter. We have started to gather some information, things we already know, things we already do, things that have already been shared this morning, and keen to undergo some industry engagement to better understand what some of the opportunities and challenges your projects face or encounter at each stage of the project lifecycle. So, today, quick overview. What is social value? Because there actually isn't a clear definition of that either. Present a bit of a framework that RPS has created to help projects deliver social value, and a quick overview of each stage of the project life cycle. I'm then going to hand to my colleague, Kapil Kulkarni, who will share a case study that we would like to present to you in New South Wales on how we've quantified the social benefits in New South Wales. So what do we mean by social value? Australia does not have a working definition, but Social Value International, one of the many organisations out there who try to quantify, they are in fact a leading body that promote best practice, and they define it as the total impact of a project or investment has on an individual's well-being. So this includes social, environmental and economic outcomes. There are slightly different variations of this definition globally, but there are some common traits. It is about an individual's well-being, their quality of life. It is about measuring the change that has happened because of that investment, and it's about quantifying that change. I think what's also important that measuring piece is both qualitative and quantitative. So while it would be helpful to have a working definition in Australia, and I think it's a really exciting time with the first wellbeing budget being launched later this year by the federal government, RPS has adopted the Social Value International's definition and has developed a social value framework for infrastructure projects that we advise clients on, which is based on these core principles of starting with measuring what matters for stakeholders. And what's important is this framework takes a place-based approach. It's a place-based systems approach, I should say, to demonstrate the key themes that drive optimal livability, resilience, and prosperity. This systems approach demonstrates that interdisciplinary themes and the ways of working allow us to see the bigger picture. And each theme will have varying levels of relevance and impact on projects, depending on what actually matters to that community. Highlighting that there is actually no one-size-fits-all for delivering social value in infrastructure. We actually have to embed this systems approach when a project is initiated, as we gain a better understanding of these overlapping benefits and better recognise the lasting project benefits of the investment. So while we continue to see this unprecedented spending on infrastructures, we need to ensure that those injections of funds don't just generate assets and traditional economic benefits, but also create wider, lasting social benefits for communities. So to make this a useful guide, we're going to be splitting it up through the project life cycle. We understand that not everything is this linear, but in general, the first 3 stages, we really want to focus on the planning of projects versus later stages where the project is in delivery. What we do know is to set projects up for success, we actually need to invest in these early stages of a project planning to consider the long-term benefits. We need to take this wide lens view rather than approaching projects from a narrow asset-based perspective. So for the purposes of today, I'm actually only going to focus on the first 3 phases. In project initiation, the opportunity is really to take a place-based view, and that has to start with country. We need to listen, we need to understand the unique value of country and the experience of First Nations. We need to build relationships with traditional owners and Aboriginal communities to improve our own cultural understanding and knowledge of how projects can support the health and well-being of country. We also need to understand who the broader community is, what they value, and what their needs are. Some of the challenges at this initiation stage, though, is that actually adopting a country-led approach is not that well understood, and it's quite a new thing, but we all have to take responsibility. Project and planning teams need to engage with traditional owners early to ensure we connect and design with country in mind. Genuine engagement has not generally started at this stage of a project. It often happens a bit later, which means that unique project needs and risks are not actually fully understood in this phase. But some of the challenges we've encountered is that infrastructure projects can be narrow in scope, forcing them to be implemented in silos, both from an asset and government delivery perspective. There is an early focus on traditional economic assessments developed from cost-benefit analysis rather than this consideration of broader evidence to support the potential social value. So this means projects cannot actually fully address social needs and create that lasting value. So I guess a couple of key takeaways from our key early findings is really start with country, but country takes time, and project budgets need to allow for community input up front. When we move to a business case stage, it actually involves a very detailed assessment of options that respond to identified problems and opportunities. It is much more a formal process for decision making to ensure we secure the right approvals, the right funding from relevant government agencies. So we've identified two key opportunities really at this stage to deliver social value. The first one is co-design. Seeking input already from communities is really valuable, but actually actively co-designing with communities who will benefit from the completed project can actually produce better outcomes. Co-design is increasingly being used to design services and products that involve people who use or are affected by that service or product. Secondly, a bit of a message we've heard today, adopting a consistent application of social value measurement to guide decision making. There's a range of methodologies that are being used across different asset types, but we really need to be clear about what we're actually trying to value and achieve, and my colleague Kapil will dive a bit more into detail about that. So really the challenges at a business case level is really this lack of consistency in how co-design is actually delivered and when is it the best time to use that method, and that there's no single approach to measuring social value. Key takeaways, really co-designing with community can enable us a better understanding of what social value means to the ultimate beneficiaries, and that the measurements we're using for infrastructure should be determined by country, community, and co-designing. Procurement. This is a really important stage, and there have been some really positive and encouraging developments in the way social procurement is being integrated into public spending decisions. But we believe more can be done to secure this higher social dividend. A clear opportunity exists to elevate the conversation about social procurement as a way of creating social value, identifying clear targets, shifting from something that, you know, is encouraged and nice to have to something that is actually required. But a big challenge for social procurement is that actually the policies differ from every state across Australia, so there is no consistency. But one of the challenges that are consistent across the nation is that there is limited capacity amongst social benefit suppliers to meet those obligations and meet those opportunities to fulfil the procurement arrangements. So in terms of some key takeaways, have ambitious social procurement targets and reporting mechanisms, but actually engage with the sector, those small businesses, and create an environment and an ecosystem where those small businesses, whether it's a social enterprise, whether it's an Indigenous business, can grow with the pipeline of opportunities that are available. So for both the delivery and operation stage, I would say the key messages here is the importance of incorporating everything from the first three stages into the deliverables and those commitments into relevant contracts. You can download the paper today online and you can get a little bit more, but this is where we want to get your feedback on what some of the challenges and opportunities are for each of these stages. So really the key messages for today from our initial findings are to actually unlock the outcomes that matter for communities. You need to listen, understand the unique value of country. You need to engage early, you need to engage often and throughout the whole project life cycle with both community and key stakeholders, and you need to support local economies. What we also know is that everyone has a role to play in ensuring we deliver these meaningful outcomes. So we know there are some levers that we can that are needed to succeed, such as clear policy, but we also know we need to identify champions of change within projects. We need strong project leadership. We need to engage with stakeholders. We need to learn from the past in order to kind of push the boundaries for the next project. And we need to measure what matters. And I guess the question for all of you today is, what role will you play? We'll be conducting some focus groups and some interviews over the next couple of months and really encourage you to get involved, because we really want to improve the sector and try and demystify how we deliver social outcomes through infrastructure projects. We're also looking for case studies and examples of what's worked well and what hasn't worked so well. Both of them are just as important. So how you can get involved, download the discussion paper that's both on the Infrastructure Sustainability Council website today or the RPS website. It will be floating around LinkedIn as well. Register your interest with either Laura or myself and we'll definitely reconnect. So I'm now going to pass on to my colleague Kapil, who is around, here he is, he's walking up, who's going to do a bit of a deep dive into a case study where we've quantified the social benefits, and then I will be back to chair a panel discussion.
There you go.
So I'll be talking about accounting for the social benefits of regional transport investments. Firstly, I just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors and study partners, Lee Jollo, who's RPS's National Lead of Economics, myself and Kirsten Fisher, who at the time of this work was with Transport for New South Wales as the client lead, and is now with RPS as well. I'll go over the context of this research, which was to value the social benefits of a regional transport infrastructure investment. And what I'll talk about is a bit why this sort of work is needed. And in this case, it related to what we saw as a gap in the conventional approaches to value the benefits of regional transport projects. I'll talk about the framework that we used for valuation, and at a high level, the technical approach. I won't go into the detail, but feel free to catch me later, or if we have time for questions, I can delve into a couple of things. So firstly, the project was the Great Western Highway Upgrade Program, and our work related to a business case for this program. And the project involved an upgrade to the Great Western Highway between Katoomba and Lithgow, about 34 kilometres to be a 4-lane carriageway. Now, this project was more than just about addressing transport issues. So the objectives of the program was also to address issues related to disadvantaged communities, freight use, and tourists. And one of the rationales for our work was that the conventional approaches to do cost-benefit analysis of transport investment were likely to overlook some of the significant benefits. So the BCR or the benefit cost ratio from using the conventional approaches was likely to be understated. So the program was designed to meet a broader set of social objectives and than just transport connectivity. And I'll outline how we estimated some of those benefits. Now, there are several approaches to valuing social benefits, from cost-benefit analysis, which we ultimately used, all the way to social return on investment, which we heard a bit about today. Now, we used cost-benefit analysis, and the reason for that was because that's required for New South Wales business cases. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why this sort of work is important. And when we're looking at infrastructure investments in regional Australia, there's a little bit of a different context. So a significant amount of Australia's population and workforce reside in the regions where there is relatively greater social disadvantage and communities relatively less well serviced by infrastructure. So these projects are not just about transport. Now, the framework that we've used here is cost-benefit analysis, and CBA is very specific and very prescriptive around what can and can't be included and how that ought to be valued, which makes valuing some of these social benefits a bit trickier. And in this case, the objectives of the project included a variety of social outcomes. The two that we focused on were health and education, and we'll see how we did that and what we found. But these two we found were more conducive to valuation and also likely to be significant. So as I said, I won't get into the full technical detail, obviously, of how this was done, but as a sort of lay explanation of how we went about valuing these benefits, the idea is relatively simple. What transport projects do by making transport, it improves connectivity and therefore lowers the cost of accessing transport, or the price. And when I say cost, I mean what we call the generalized cost, so not just the operating costs of the vehicles, but also the time taken to get to where you want to go. And what we know is if you lower the price of a good or service, you increase the demand. So in the case of health and education, by making access to health and education services, by improving that access, you're going to have more people accessing those services, benefiting from them, and we can value those benefits. That's just what's being illustrated on this slide, where what you're doing is you're making that generalized cost lower and increasing the demand. Now, what we found was that these benefits are not insignificant at all. So if we look at health first, health can be valued by the community having greater access and using these health services more. We're reducing the risk of premature mortality and illness. That can be valued by linking that to the value of a statistical life. And for this project, we estimated health benefits of around $500 million in present value over the life of the project. With education, that can be valued by estimating the improvement in human capital, which means the community has more skills and knowledge in the workforce, making them more productive, and the value of that extra productivity in the economy can also be valued. In the case of education, we estimated 40 million in benefits, present value over the life of the project. And I've outlined here the assumptions for transparency, but I'll just note that we were quite conservative in our valuation. So what I'd like to conclude on is our study found that while some of these social benefits, yes, they are tricky to express in economic terms, and the methods aren't always there in the standard guidelines, they can be estimated robustly in accordance with Treasury and other central agency requirements. It does require some bottom-up work, but there are some great sources and methods around that can be used. A great example is the UK Social Value Bank, which we've just got a snapshot of the types of outcomes that source can be used to value. In our case, we only focused on health and education, but there's quite a broader mix there that can be brought to bear. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jane Nichols from the ISC, and I'm stepping in very briefly for Kate. So we're following on now to a panel discussion, and I would just like to introduce our panelist for that. And if Vanessa, you'd like to come back on stage and join us to moderate. So joining us virtually, we'll have Kieran Dibb. Kieran is the Technical Services person for the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. We'll also have joining us Chad Smithies, the Chief Executive Officer of Reliance Rail, and Peter Sylvester, the Assistant Program Director from Cross River Rail.
Sit in the middle.
Thank you very much. If I could just ask all of you to please send in your questions. The panel would like very much to have an interactive session, so please send those in and we'll look forward to answering them. Thank you very much.
Sorry, this feels a little bit weird. I feel like I'm very far away from my panel members. And hi, Kieran online. Nice to see you. Excellent. So, just a reminder: questions. I have the iPad here, so make sure you ask lots of questions. I might need someone to. Something's happened. Can I get someone just to look at that for a minute? Excellent. So, what we have met, us as a panel, and as you know, we're launching this discussion guide today, which is really about helping us engage more broadly with industry about some of the opportunities and challenges in delivering social value. So I'm keen to obviously hear from the three of you today to kind of kick off this conversation. So my first question is to all of you, and I'm gonna go to Kieran online. And the question is, what does social value mean to you? And from your perspective, who are some of the beneficiaries of social value?
Thanks very much. I guess from our perspective, all communities benefit from recognising the social value infrastructure. From a funding or a project kick-off sort of perspective, major infrastructure in popular areas proves this investment much easier, just from a benefit cost for users' perspective. However, much of the work that QRA does is in regional Queensland areas, and I guess in regional Queensland areas, it's much more recognised for its broader benefits to the immediate community, the regional community, as well as state and national supply chains.
Thanks, Kieran. Peter.
Hello everyone. So what does social value mean to myself or someone in Cross River Rail.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one, and I heard some of the presenters before talk about the individual well-being. Probably from my perspective, social value is actually the application of infrastructure to benefit the greatest cross-section of the community that you possibly can. So how do you leverage your infrastructure to get a greater well-being outcome, whether it's economic, recreational, or for health or other reasons?
Yep. It definitely is about that multiplier effect, isn't it? And Chad.
Thanks, Vanessa. Probably a little bit more than what others have said, but yeah, for us, we're Sydney-based. We own trains, and the intrinsic nature of trains is to provide public transport, and public transport in itself is a multiplier for everything. So accessible travel, better value travel, whether that be for education or healthcare or otherwise. But ultimately, we want to operate in that sort of, under that ecological ceiling we might be operating at, and above that social foundation. So we're all the beneficiary really of social value. So we all wear different hats at different times. So for us really it's about that commuter and providing safe, reliable transport.
Yep, so the commuter is the end beneficiary?
Ultimately, yes.
Excellent. So I think, Peter, it is a good point about your application in terms of Cross River Rail in itself is one of those transformative projects, I should say, because it's inherently about connecting Southeast Queensland. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that multiplier effect of the project and what social outcomes does the project actually unlock for the region?
Yeah, I guess at its core, Cross River Rail is really about connecting people and connecting community. If you cast your mind back, and it's probably going back to about 2010, 2012, when the Queensland Government first identified capacity constraints within the rail system in particular. There is only one river crossing in Brisbane for rail capacity. That was actually starting to get quite constrained. So the government did quite a lot of work around how do you unlock the capacity in the system. Does that involve different technologies to stack trains together? Do we need another river crossing, et cetera, which led to Cross River Rail being proposed as an alternative. And really what that does is actually it unlocks that capacity constraint in the core of SEQ's rail transport system, essentially doubles the existing capacity. It actually does more than that. I don't know if you've seen it. It was released probably a few weeks ago now. The Transport Minister released SEQ Rail Connect, and really that starts to bring into sharp relief what does Cross River Rail, what is it now unlocked in terms of the rail system and then the transport system more broadly. You're starting to see other rail transport projects come on stream. Gold Coast Faster Rail is one of those. The work that'll be done up on the Sunshine Coast to really unlock the rail network, and then leveraged off the back of that comes the local transport buses, etc., that can start to link in and create really quite a well-connected, well-serviced system, which then underpins a lot of good social outcomes in connecting people to where they work, where they live, where they play, and where they choose to recreate. So I'm really quite excited to be a part of this project, have been on the project since 2017, and it's really been wonderful to see how the project has evolved over time to try and realise some of these opportunities that we're starting to see now. And something we did quite early on in the project as a team is why are we on this project? And the overwhelming theme was this project means more. And when you unpack that, it's not just about connecting people, it's about all of those opportunities that come working on a project like this.
Yeah. I think they're once in a generation projects really to work on as well. I am going to go to Chad because I think it is quite interesting because Reliance Rail own the trains in Sydney.
Some of them. Not
Some of them. But you've managed to secure the first green sustainability-linked loan in Asia Pacific to the value of $1.8 billion, which I can't comprehend, over 21 years. So I'm interested in the role Reliance Rail has in delivering social value and why you went down this path.
I think it touches on a lot of what was said today, which it comes down to the individuals and the people involved. What we found is, as an SPV or a special purpose vehicle, we're established, so we're much further down the track. Our contracts were written in 2006 and before, so ESG was a notion. There's nothing written into the contracts. There's no requirements, there's no measurements. My CFO, Louise Ida, and myself had a desire to move things forward. So we had a unique opportunity in our life cycle, our project life cycle. We have another 30 plus years of potential rail operations for Sydney. We move about 40% of Sydney's commuters every day, a little bit less with COVID, but still the same percentage. And with the lenders, we were starting to see an appetite. And again, I think that was touched on with both equity, our shareholders and the lenders going, there is a different way of doing things going forward. It is a bit of a risk for us because there's no contract requirement, and typically under every contract, someone has to pay for something. This is probably the first improvement that has a social, environmental governance benefit that is paying for itself. We did have to convince the state it was a good idea. We did have to convince our other investors it's a good idea, but I think once we got that down on paper, no one could say that there wasn't an overall benefit from pursuing a loan. Not only is it sustainably linked, but it's also green. We're electrified rail, so we sort of tick that box, so we could have stopped there. But the opportunity to actually do something material like focus on energy efficiency of trains or reduced water consumption at the depot, putting solar PV on. And we can talk about it later, but working with ISK, because when you're trying to standardize something across 13 or 14 lenders and trying to get an understanding of how do you measure ESG and sustainability, working with ISK has been great because that gives us a good benchmark to engage with.
We should definitely go back to ISK, definitely in this panel discussion. I will go to Kieran in a minute, but I guess where you're at the other end of the cycle really from Peter. Peter, I am interested in what some of the opportunities you've been able to deliver through your project from a social value perspective.
Yeah, look, there's probably quite a few that our delivery partners have sort of really pushed forward, but if there's one that I could present that talks to what we've done as a delivery authority is really shift the dial on accessibility to public transport. Very early on, we identified an opportunity to really make sure that the infrastructure that we're providing, and we are spending a lot of money on this public infrastructure, is accessible to all. Whether you do have a disability, if it's the case of trying to get your kids onto the train, pushing a stroller, taking your luggage, very quickly it becomes quite obvious how usable or not your public transport is. We set up an accessibility reference group very early on in the project. They've been involved through the initial design phases. We actually set up prototype testing. We're actually quite excited because we're getting to the end stages of one of our deliverables, which is a suburban train station in the south of Brisbane called Yeronga Station. We're approaching its final completion, and the accessibility reference group there will go out before everyone else and actually do the final test to see how everything works. For me, that's actually really quite an achievement, building in accessibility for all from the initial start. It actually has changed quite a lot of the concepts around how we design our stations. A lot of the things that seem small are actually really quite important when it comes to implementation. If you do them early, you're actually saving quite a lot of cost as well because you're not having to retrofit things, and it becomes a really good outcome. So that's one of the really good outcomes I think we've achieved. We've actually also now developed an accessibility reference guide, which is now being taken back into the Department of Transport and Main Roads to see how that can get implemented more broadly as they upgrade parts of the South East Queensland network.
I think that's a really good example of co-design, like when it's being used at the right time and the right place to really influence design and get that co-ownership. And the fact that I think the key with co-design is you have to let go of control and you have to allow those users to influence the outcome, which sounds like you've exactly done that. Question for you, Kieran. Through your work at Queensland Reconstruction Authority, you see communities when they're at their most vulnerable, often when infrastructure has failed them. So how does a community's perception of infrastructure change after they experience a disaster?
Yeah, thanks very much, Vanessa. I guess it's first sort of key to understand the difference in regional communities and urban communities across Queensland. There's very much a difference in terms of expectations, and there's very much a difference in terms of resilience in different communities in different facets. The need for freight and supplies compared to passenger movements has obviously very different impacts on different communities, and the absolute demand or need for immediate access sometimes in the urban or city environments, even down your local road when there's another 6 roads, is sometimes very difficult to fathom when you compare it to a regional sort of context. Our urban and city communities are often quick to forget impacts or any disruption to life as normal. I guess this is probably pretty evident when you look at the bounce back in property values after the 2011 floods in Brisbane. The communities do eventually forget whether it's 1 or 2 cycles, but they do forget. But I guess at the end of the day, the true and direct impacts, once they've actually been experienced, they often have profound impacts. And despite logic, they still often catch people by surprise, or they're unexpected. The challenge I guess we have is leveraging these learnings of individuals more broadly across communities and regions.
I just want to repeat, there was a bit of a noise at the back of the stage. Did you say one of the challenges with communities is the vigilance of just engaging with them? Sorry, someone catch you?
Yeah, sorry, I've got a little bit
no, that's okay.
background disturbance there. I guess the challenge we have is leveraging the learnings of individuals after they've been impacted, so individuals and communities. In a regional context for us, quite often when you're talking about strategic roads of connection, it's evacuation routes and having alternative routes in place or systems in place where movements can occur. In the urban environment, that's a very different scenario because the road network or transport network actually has a lot more redundancy, even though it's meant to cater for a much larger capacity. We find that, I guess, our regional communities in Queensland are a lot more resilient. They're a lot more prepared for when a road network or a link in a network goes down for a matter of days or a matter of weeks. And quite often are prepared in terms of supplies, water, power, backup, and anything else they require from an essential service, whereas in a urban or semi-urban environment can cause significant issues.
Yeah. It's a really good point about the difference between regional and urban, and particularly with Queensland having such a large regional community. And I guess linked to, and following what you're saying, but what role can infrastructure play in building that community's resilience to shocks and change? I can't believe people would forget that easily if there was a disaster, but obviously, I haven't lived through one personally, so I don't know. But, and what is the role of the public sector versus the private sector?
One of the, as terrible as disasters are, from an engineering perspective, you learn the most from failures, and disasters are one of those amazing things where it points out all the weaknesses in a transport network. It really focuses the attention on those things that aren't working well, those things that have failed, and those things that actually cause significant grief to the state, to the region, or to individuals. So recovery from a disaster, I guess, provides an opportune time to get involved to try to better the situation. We have a program called Betterment, which we've rolled out historically since 2013, and we've had subsequent revisions of that where we actually try to target those assets where they are repeatedly damaged and repeatedly causing impacts. I guess from its virtue or from its establishment, the Betterment program was meant to avoid future costs in terms of recovery funds I guess more recently we've started to look at recovery from a nation's perspective, not just in terms of infrastructure recovery, but the impacts that's having on the community, mental health, community impacts, housing impacts, all these other bits and pieces. So as the view of disaster recovery is expanded, so is the consideration in terms of avoided costs, in terms of investing in infrastructure. So we're now starting to look at the avoided costs across a broader spectrum when investing simply in one little bit of infrastructure, whether it's a floodway, a bridge, even a road, whatever that may be.
Yeah. Thanks, Kieran. I'm going to start asking some questions from the audience, so encourage you to keep asking because I've only got 2% left battery on the iPad. Now, sorry, take the glasses off. This is a similar question to what I had down for you, Chad. What are the specific KPIs associated with Reliance Rail, and how are you measuring and reporting performance against them?
It's a good question. So it's something we're working through. I look around the room and I see the SDGs on the tables, which is great.
Yeah.
But obviously, each organisation fits into those differently. So we spent a little bit of time initially just around those and our material issues and what's important to us as an organisation, our operations. So things like energy, waste, water, climate resilience. And those are the things that we became more passionate about engaging with both the state and our lenders on. And then looking at, okay, well, what can we do in that space? How can we implement tangible change? So energy efficiency of trains, improving those, reducing wastewater at our facility, installing solar PV, and then more generally measuring performance across the project, which is where ISCA comes in, because it was a challenge to try and find some way or somehow of doing that in a sort of a constructive, standardised way. We're also building the plane and flying it at the same time, so we're having to build the measurement process after we've agreed the loan, and then have that independently verified, and then measure against that.
What were the requirements by the banks, though?
The banks they're all different.
Okay.
It's all a little bit disparate, a bit like everything we're trying to do here. So their process was to out of a consortium of banks was to put a few leaders in place, so they would coordinate those requirements. And their view really was looking to us to inform them about where we could make improvement. So they were very open to that engagement, but obviously, things need to be measurable. And I think back to all the conversations we had, if you can't measure it, you have no idea where you are. So I encourage everybody to, at the early outset of a project, measure as much as you can, get those benchmarking in, and then consistently measure performance against that.
Well, that brings us to SDG 17, which is all about partnerships and collaboration. So that's come up again today. I am just deciding on whether to go a iPad question for you too, Peter. And this could probably be for all of you. Given the panel is government focused, how are you building your contracts to ensure that social procurement is a focus for your delivery partners? Would love to see a contractor on this panel.
Look, I must admit I can't talk directly to the contracts because I'm not close enough to the actual detail. But what I will say is that the contractors have been more than forward-leaning in terms of looking at those deliverable items in construction to achieve better social outcomes. We do have, as part of at least our state approval, a requirement to achieve a sustainability rating. We are using the IS rating. And so our contractors have been very focused on achieving that through their design and into delivery. That's just one way that it's been captured, is through the actual state approval process, which is then flowed through into the contracts.
So what happens in your situation where your contracts were written like a decade ago?
We have to convince both the state. So that's the interesting, on a PPP, where you're dedicated to a particular project, what we found is it's actually a unique position to be in, because you are coordinating everybody around this particular asset, and you're also the custodian of that asset for the future. So it gave us an opportunity to look ahead 30 years and plan, where might we be if we govern this as a good citizen, rather than just govern it according to the project requirement.
Okay.
And that allowed us to convince the state, plus our contractor, plus the lenders, plus our stakeholders, that this is the right thing to do. It's for the greater good.
Yep. Wow, amazing. We will come back to that, but I want to give Kieran the opportunity to also answer this question, because obviously, working particularly in regional Queensland, there are a lot of wider considerations in regards to regional supply chains and economic development opportunities. So what role do you play in that, and what's some of the outcomes that are being delivered, and the role of the contractor?
Thanks very much. We don't get necessarily involved with the contract side of it as a traditional grants program, so the procurement and the contract arrangements are left to the individual applicants, whether that's Department of Transport and Main Roads or the councils for us. But I guess where we play our part is in the guidelines in terms of the consideration of what type of projects you get up, in terms of informing those business cases either to the Commonwealth, or for helping the applicant inform those through to us in terms of applying for a particular grant. Ensuring, I guess, that the right considerations are in there in terms of metrics for proving up which project is a suitable project and which project is going to have a benefit over a neighbouring project.
Okay. A couple more questions from the audience. What methods does the panel find are most successful for quantifying future social value in terms of dollar value? I'm not sure if you've got experience of doing that, so I'm not sure if you can. Yeah, no, that's okay. I just thought I'd ask it.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
that's a good question. That can't help.
Not yet.
It'd be useful to have some standard that we could align to, though.
I think that's been a consistent message, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Look, I actually want to come back to, I guess, a question for me around culture, because you've convinced a lot of people that this is the right thing to do. So what are the opportunities and challenges do you see in terms of changing that's culture that's needed to deliver the evidence outcomes that you require for this line, but more broadly around social value? And I'll ask you the same question.
Look, I think for us it's about bringing it into the conversation every day. We're very good at sitting from a project review. We meet weekly, we meet monthly, we look at reliability, we look at availability, we look at safety. Those are all the common things. Do we look at anything else? Not really. So we need to actually bring that to the table. And it's up to the leaders in the room to set the tone, to encourage their group, their circle of influence to start having those conversations. So we're getting pretty good at things like Are You OK Day? Fantastic. But there's a whole lot more that we can do. So if we just talk about energy efficiency, and you ask the question, so how much energy did we use this month? Nobody knows. We know how many safety incidents we had, though. So the more we bring that in, the more we set that agenda, the more everybody underneath starts to follow that conversation. And we found that very successful, both with the state, with our contractors. You can set the standard, and we can all hit the standard, but the standard is the minimum. It's not actually where we need to be.
Yeah.
Probably a very similar theme, actually. As I mentioned before, when we did a piece of work with our staff, and it has been reflected a few times now, on Cross River Rail, the culture really is this project means more. But when you go to implement that, well, what does that actually mean? And to some of these things about social value, or how can we leverage what we're doing, it's about doing things with purpose, defining what you actually want to achieve, and then how we're going to get there. Some of the things that at the start we didn't know how we were going to quite do it. One example for us was our Experience Centre. We actually have an Experience Centre in the centre of Brisbane and Albert Street. If you're ever in town, please drop in. We did that with quite a unique purpose. It wasn't just there to have people come and interrogate what the project was about. We actually saw it as a tool to implement a whole bunch of things we wanted to get out of the project. Share the knowledge that we have gained through the project, whether it's knowledge gained through archaeology, the generosity of First Nations people sharing their knowledge and they're happy to share more broadly, education programs focusing on STEM, particularly through the older primary into the secondary schools, and also specific pieces of education rolling out in the broader community. So doing things with purpose.
Which is kind of where we started with Ainsley this morning, really, wasn't it? Why we're all here and why we work in this sector. There is another question, maybe for you, Chad. Can the panel expand on how they engaged with the ISC to support sustainability-linked loan applications, and what opportunities you see in other sectors, such as energy?
Yeah, so for us, we set out on this journey with established PPP, a good reliable asset, long-term contract and no requirements. And we started looking around Australia, so who can we engage with? And ISK came up pretty quickly in that conversation as to, did it naturally apply to us? No. So we had to do a little bit of work around, well, how do we fit into something like that? And what we have found, though, is that over time, other rail projects have had the same idea. The community has sort of shifted. That pull that we've talked about has moved. So we see an understanding with some of the banks, but not all of them, that something like ISK is a good idea. But there needs to be a whole lot of education around this and communication. So we facilitated a couple of sessions for that engagement, and that went a long way to getting the lenders comfortable with, well, what is ISK and how does it work, and how do you measure things. There's one, we've tied ourselves up in a lot of reporting, so we all report an awful lot about things, but how do we actually measure what we do successfully is much harder, and I think that's where ISK is starting to come in.
And there's not a lot of consistency between the reporting tools either.
Very little consistency. Consistency among the participants and consistency among the different industries and the life cycles in the industry. So those projects that are legacy projects like us, rarely does need that state sponsorship going forward to start to drive that level of change in, because a lot of these assets have to run for another 30, 40, 50 years. We need to offer them opportunity to improve.
Yep. I think, though, having a PPP is an interesting contractual model that allows you to do that as well.
Definitely, yeah. So, a lot of people see PPPs as high risk and a number have failed, but I think with the right state sponsorship and the right stakeholders and shareholders, we've clearly demonstrated that you can take something that's a legacy project, legacy set of requirements, and build a more sustainable future out of that.
Yeah. Excellent. I'm going to hand this next question to Peter. So this is, how do you prioritise value in a highly culturally diverse community? Because you would do a lot of engagement as a project. I think you explained the experience centre as a tool.
Yeah.
Maybe just to even explain a little bit about how you engage with communities, and at what stage did you start that engagement?
Yeah, that's okay. So probably our main engagement started when the project started to become real back in 2017. So there was engagement both with the market in terms of how we were going to deliver this project, and also engagement with the community broadly, but it was really focused on how we're going to manage impacts through construction. That was our primary focus back in 2017. What we've actually seen happen through time is our focus has not changed off managing our impacts through construction, but what we're finding is that managing and assisting communities through managing their disruption to their travel has become a far more important thing.
Right.
It comes back to, I guess, transport infrastructure and what does it mean for people. It is connection into their communities, connection to work, connection to recreation. Any slight disruption to that can be quite abrupt for folks. So the big learning for us in terms of some of the key values we're trying to now manage is managing travel disruptions.
Yeah, and so in terms of the question, I guess, was about a culturally diverse community. Are there any examples of how, it's not a one-size-fits-all model, is it? Like in terms of, it's a question of communication
Yes,
as well as engagement.
Look, that's true. There's one specific example I can think of where, and we've started to roll this out across different parts of the network. You've got some parts of the Southern Corridor in Brisbane are very culturally diverse. Yeronga Station, which I mentioned before, it's to the south of Brisbane, has a school in there with something like 18 or 19 different language groups. We were taking out that station, totally changing the way kids would get to school, their parents would do the drop-offs and pick-ups. We found very quickly that they had no concept of what we were doing or how we were going to disrupt their day-to-day life. We actually brought in, we got help from SBS, ABC and a few other culturally diverse organisations to assist us with communicate what we were going to do in terms of travel disruption and how you can manage that. And did a lot of work directly with teachers and into the classrooms. That was a big learning for us, was picking up that we actually weren't getting to a part of the community. And how we picked that up was kids were running across a really busy road. Doesn't everyone know that you're supposed to be taking an alternative route? And that's when we triggered, we actually haven't got to this community.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important note, that we are all still learning and we have to keep learning on how we improve. Okay, last question for you all. What do you see as one practical action we can all take away to improve the maturity of social value in our sector? I will go to you, Kieran.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think from the one major takeaway I'd suggest, particularly from a disaster recovery perspective, is really understanding your infrastructure network, the reliances the different infrastructure components have on each other, and the criticality of each of the pieces of infrastructure in terms of redundancy, in terms of availability, level of service, and knowing what the impacts are when each of these bits of infrastructure drop off, what the knock-on impacts are to the community, what the knock-on impacts are to the next bit of infrastructure that's reliant upon that. In terms of informing the best investment, we want to really try to identify those spots where we can gain the greatest return on investment in terms of community benefits as well as avoided costs going forward.
Thanks, Kieran. Last question, a practical action to take away to improve the maturity of social value in our sector.
I'll go.
Either of you go.
I guess turn up and be a good citizen.
Turn up.
Think a citizen is not just a consumer. We need to think about how we can give back and how we can engage. So let's turn up at those meetings, at those functions, at the dinner table, and let's have those conversations about what is actually important. Because what's important to me is different to what's important to everybody else. Let's have those conversations. Let's understand what it is.
Yeah. So as individuals, regardless of whether you're in this sector or not,
Exactly.
you're putting the challenge out to everyone, just taking responsibility. I'm hoping the fact that we're all sustainability professionals, we're doing that anyway. But yes, I think it's a good.
So, yes.
But I think you raise a good point that actually what's important for you is not the same as what's important for Peter, and actually understanding that diversity is just as important.
Yeah, and probably one of the key takeaways for me is sharing the information so you can learn, because what you might find is that what you learn may not be directly applicable, but you can apply it in a different context. So it's the opportunity to share learnings is probably the key takeaway, because what I have picked up is we all do things in a slightly different way, very difficult to measure some of these outcomes, but the opportunity to share the information as a knowledge group will certainly assist with the learning.
Which means that I've got one more question that's come through. How far away do you think Australia is from having a national standard for measuring social value? Like, have you seen a shift? Like, do you think we're getting closer?
There's definitely a shift in conversation. We're seeing that across all industries that we engage with. A lot of people are still waiting. They're waiting for something to pull them into it rather than they're ready to jump in themselves.
Right, so looking for leadership, something
Looking for leadership, yep.
something coming from the top down.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. There's certainly an appetite for change. The conversation has started, but we still revert back to when we're thinking about our projects at the front end, we revert back to business cases.
Yep.
Business cases can't really capture the social value component, and a lot of the time that's what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's right. Which brings us back to like the thriving nations and that systems thinking right at the start.
Yep.
Kieran, that question's gone. But I guess how far away do you think we are from measuring social value? Have you seen a difference in the organisation that you work at?
I've definitely seen a difference in my sort of industry, but that's I guess by what we've been forced into. So in responding to disasters, you're almost forced to start progressing the way you're thinking when you see the same impacts happening over and over again. Our biggest challenge is, I guess, in terms of the design of these other community recovery programs for investment in resilience. In both the community resilience as well as the infrastructure resilience, is identifying up front how we determine what success looks like. So the evaluation components of that to really understand whether or not it's a good investment and how they can inform the next time around we do invest.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kieran. And I've had the sign flash up saying finish up. So I think we're back on track. So thank you very much for entertaining us for the last 40 minutes, and thank you to our panellists, Kieran, Chad, Peter.